I still remember the way the light fell that afternoon, a particular slant through the kitchen window, catching dust motes dancing in the air above the old pine table. It was late autumn, just before the leaves truly let go, and the air held that crisp, promising scent of wood smoke and turning earth. Sarah, my Sarah, had left her favorite blue enamel mug on the counter, right where I always told her not to. But what truly froze me, what made the quiet hum of the refrigerator sound like a distant, menacing drone, wasn't the mug. It was the small circular indentation on the table where my grandmother's silver locket used to rest. A locket I had worn since my 18th birthday, passed down through generations, holding a tiny, faded photograph of my mother as a young woman. It was gone. And for a second, no one said a word. If this sounds like your silence, stay. You don't owe them your forgiveness, not anymore. And if you know a woman who carried too much for too long, give her this story. That locket wasn't just metal and a picture. It was a tangible thread to a lineage of quiet strength, a reminder of the women who had navigated their own storms with dignity. Its absence, a perfect circle on the polished wood, was the first real crack in the foundation I thought I'd built for myself, for us. Sarah was still in high school then, 17 and brimming with the kind of self-absorption that often cloaks itself as youthful exuberance. I'd seen it before in small ways, little liberties she'd taken with my possessions, my time, my patience. A borrowed scarf never returned, a rescheduled appointment I'd forgotten to note, a story told about her achievements that subtly, almost imperceptibly, erased my contributions to them. I found the locket later, weeks later, tucked into a box of costume jewelry in her room. Not hidden exactly, but certainly not displayed, not cared for. It was tangled with cheap plastic necklaces and glittery earrings, its silver tarnished, the tiny clasp bent. When I asked her about it, her eyes, so like my own but with a harder glint I hadn't yet named, widened innocently. "Oh, Mom, I just thought it was so pretty. I forgot I even had it. You always leave it out." "You called it tradition." I learned to call it a cage. That was the first time I felt the deep, cold chill of something beyond carelessness. It was a quiet appropriation, a taking without asking, a dismissal of my ownership and my feelings, cloaked in a flimsy veil of casualness. I tried to tell myself it was a phase, a teenage rite of passage. The daughters push boundaries, test limits. But the pattern, once I started truly seeing it, was relentless. It wasn't just physical objects, it was subtler. My stories retold by her at family gatherings with a slight shift in emphasis that made her the hero, the insightful one, the one who truly understood. My career advice, offered freely and thoughtfully, later presented as her own brilliant epiphany to a colleague. My dreams whispered in confidence over cups of tea, resurfacing weeks later as her grand ambitions, meticulously planned and executed without a single acknowledgement of their origin. It was as if she absorbed pieces of me, integrated them into her own narrative, and then, with a quiet sigh of contentment, exhaled me out of the picture entirely. My husband, David, bless his kind, oblivious heart, never noticed. Or perhaps he chose not to. He saw Sarah through the rose-tinted lens of a devoted father, her every action a testament to her intelligence, her charm, her boundless potential. He'd nod along, beaming, as she recounted a story that was, in essence, mine, his eyes gleaming with pride. "Isn't she something, Helen? he'd say, squeezing my hand, completely unaware that the something she was largely built on the quiet, uncredited scaffolding of my own life. They called it family. I knew it was merely a stage. This wasn't about being excluded. It was about dismantling their carefully constructed lie. I began to keep a mental ledger, then a physical one. Not in anger, not at first, more out of a desperate need to understand, to quantify the insidious erosion. A small leather-bound journal kept hidden beneath my wool sweaters in the cedar chest. I'd jot down dates, brief descriptions. Oct 12, Sarah retelling story of my wilderness survival course as her own backpacking triumph at Aunt Carol's dinner. Nov 3, Sarah presenting my marketing strategy for the local co-op as her idea in community meeting. Dec 18, my grandmother's silver thimble missing from my sewing box, found it on Sarah's desk, used as a paperweight for a stack of her college applications. Each entry a tiny, almost insignificant wound, but collectively they began to paint a devastating portrait. A daughter who wasn't just growing up, but subtly, methodically, consuming the very essence of my being, turning it into fuel for her own ascent. The thimble, in particular, stung. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but it was my grandmother's, worn smooth by decades of meticulous stitching. It was a silent testament to a life of quiet creation, of mending and building. To see it used as a mere weight, discarded and forgotten among her papers, was a physical manifestation of how she viewed my contributions. Useful, perhaps, but ultimately negligible, a tool to be repurposed for her grander schemes. As the years passed, the scale of her appropriation grew. After college, she moved to the city, seemingly thriving. Her career in a competitive creative field blossomed. She was lauded for her innovative ideas, her unique perspective, and piece by piece, I recognized the echoes of my own aspirations, my own unfinished projects, my own carefully cultivated thoughts, all now gleaming under her spotlight. The way she decorated her apartment, a distinct blend of vintage finds and minimalist design, was eerily similar to the Pinterest boards I'd painstakingly curated for years, never quite having the time or resources to execute myself. The specific obscure artists she championed, the literary theories she discussed at length. They were often conversations we'd had, books I'd recommended, passions I'd quietly nurtured in the background of my life. I began to realize that my support and guidance had become, for her, a free, endless wellspring of intellectual and emotional capital. She didn't steal in the conventional sense. She absorbed. She was a sponge, soaking up my experiences, my wisdom, my very identity, and then squeezing it out as her own, polished and repackaged. There was no malice in her eyes, no grand declaration of theft, just a serene, almost innocent assumption that what was mine was, by extension, hers to claim, to mold, to profit from. This wasn't a struggle for recognition. This was a battle for my very self. My quiet observation intensified. I stopped correcting her when she misattributed something of mine to herself in casual conversation. I started listening more intently when she spoke to others, noting the precise phrasing she used, the subtle shifts in her voice when she presented an idea I knew was originally mine. I didn't confront her. Not anymore. Confrontation had always led to her feigned bewilderment, her gentle denials, her turning of the tables until I felt like the unreasonable one, the overly sensitive mother. I chose reckoning. Instead, I became a silent archivist, Digital files, screenshots, dates and times, transcripts of phone calls recorded with a small, unobtrusive device I'd purchased online, emails carefully saved and categorized, not just the instances where she borrowed from me, but the subtle ways she diminished me to others, a casual dismissal of my professional achievements, a gentle laugh about my old-fashioned ways, a sigh that implied I was a burden, a relic to be managed. These weren't evidence for a court of law, not yet. They were for me, to solidify my truth, to ensure that when the time came, my conviction would be unshakable and my actions precise. I wasn't just collecting, I was building a fortress of certainty. The meticulous logging of every quiet appropriation, every subtle erasure, became a ritual. It wasn't fueled by anger, not anymore. Anger had been replaced by something colder, sharper, clarity. It was like sifting through years of sediment, finding the glint of truth beneath layers of dust and polite smiles. I learned to detach, to observe her actions as if they belonged to a stranger, a fascinating, intricate puzzle of self-deception and unacknowledged hunger. This wasn't about being excluded. It was about dismantling their carefully constructed lie. One spring morning, Sarah called, her voice bright and breathless. She'd been offered a significant promotion at her firm, a senior creative director role. "Mom, you won't believe it. They loved the pitch. It was all my own, truly. So innovative." My stomach tightened. I knew that pitch, knew it intimately. It was the culmination of months of my own quiet research, my late-night brainstorming sessions on sustainable textile sourcing and community-led design initiatives, ideas I'd been developing for a small, local nonprofit I volunteered with. I had shared my early concepts with her over Sunday brunches, believing I was nurturing her burgeoning interest in ethical business. She'd listened intently, asked probing questions, and nodded with an almost unnerving sincerity. And for a second, no one said a word. I remembered the specific, nuanced language I'd used to describe the circular economy model, the evocative metaphors I'd crafted to explain the emotional resonance of handmade goods. Now, they were her triumphs, her brilliance. They preached forgiveness. I chose reckoning. My hand instinctively went to the small, leather-bound journal hidden in the cedar chest. Another entry. Another quiet theft, this one of a larger magnitude, a blueprint for a future I had envisioned for myself, now laid out as her foundation. David, of course, was ecstatic. He wanted to throw a celebration, invite all our friends, her colleagues. "Our brilliant Sarah," he'd beamed, oblivious to the hollowness in my chest. I smiled, a practiced, almost perfect curve of the lips, and agreed. The irony was a bitter taste. I would celebrate with them, yes, but it wouldn't be for the reasons they believed. It would be a different kind of celebration, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing weight of truth. The quiet, systematic collection of receipts continued. It wasn't always about grand ideas or career milestones. It was also the smaller, more personal appropriations. The specific, intricate family recipes passed down through my mother's side that Sarah began publishing on a popular food blog under her own name, claiming they were childhood favorites I developed myself. The unique embroidery patterns I'd spent years perfecting based on obscure folk art appearing on garments she designed for a boutique, credited solely to her uniquely inspired vision. Each instance chipped away at something fundamental, a quiet erasure of my legacy, my labor, my very identity as a creator, and a woman with her own distinct history. I didn't harm them. I merely stopped shielding them from the truth of their own making. I began to spend more time alone, not in sadness, but in focused contemplation. My garden became my sanctuary, the rhythmic turning of earth and planting of seeds, a metaphor for the patient, methodical work I was undertaking in my own life. I observed the cycle of growth, the quiet determination of roots reaching deep, the inevitable unfolding of what was planted. This external calm masked an internal fire, a slow, deliberate forging of resolve. My mind, sharp and clear, began to map out a strategy, not for revenge in the destructive sense, but for a profound rebalancing, for accountability, for truth to find its way into the light, without my direct confrontational intervention. My receipts weren't just for my own conviction anymore. They were becoming pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments that, when assembled, would reveal an undeniable picture. I considered how these quiet appropriations had impacted my own life, not just emotionally, but practically. The time I'd poured into researching and developing those textile ideas, that was time I could have spent on my own small, nascent textile business. The networking connections she'd leveraged from my contacts, those were relationships I'd built over decades. She'd built her edifice on my very foundations, brick by quiet brick. I started attending more industry events, not just within my local community, but in broader circles where Sarah's career was beginning to shine. I observed how she interacted with others, how easily she inhabited the role of the innovative visionary. There was an effortless charm about her, a way she captivated listeners with stories that, to my ears, resonated with a familiar echo of my own voice, my own experiences. And for a second, no one said a word. It was fascinating in a chilling way to witness her perform the self she had so meticulously constructed from fragments of me. Some battles aren't fought with shouts. They're won with undeniable truth. I refined my strategy. It wouldn't be a direct confrontation. Those always ended with me feeling unheard, dismissed. It needed to be quieter, more insidious in its impact, a truth released into the ether that would, by its own undeniable weight, shift perceptions and dismantle narratives. It needed to be like a slow-acting dye, seeping into the fabric of their understanding, changing the color of their world in a way they couldn't ignore or deny. My focus turned to the upcoming annual Innovators of Tomorrow Summit, a prestigious event where Sarah was slated to be a keynote speaker, presenting her latest groundbreaking work. This was the stage. This was the moment. The audience would be influential, discerning, and they would be open to new ideas, new perspectives, especially truths they hadn't considered. I didn't want to destroy her, not completely. I simply wanted to reclaim what was mine, to make visible the invisible scaffolding upon which her success rested. I wanted her to finally, irrevocably stand on her own 2 feet, without the quiet, unacknowledged support of my life. And I wanted David and all those who had been blind to finally see the careful, almost artistic way she had woven herself into the tapestry of my existence, creating a vibrant pattern that erased the threads of my own making. The planning became an intricate dance between meticulous detail and quiet discretion. I spent weeks researching the Innovators of Tomorrow Summit. Not just the schedule and the speakers, but the attendees. Who would be there? What were their interests? How did they perceive Sarah? I learned that many admired her bold vision, her fresh perspective. It confirmed my suspicions. They saw the polished exterior, the appropriated brilliance, never the deep well from which it was drawn. I felt no bitterness, only a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't about being excluded. It was about dismantling their carefully constructed lie. My attendance at the summit would be quiet. I wouldn't seek Sarah out, wouldn't make a scene. My presence would be a mere whisper in the vast auditorium, a shadow among hundreds. But my intention was a roar. I booked my flight and hotel under my maiden name, Helen Davies, a small act of reclamation, a subtle severance from the shared identity I'd inhabited for so long. It was a detail only I would notice, but it brought me a quiet satisfaction. I decided my unveiling wouldn't be a direct accusation. It would be an act of shared knowledge, an offering of truth to those who had unknowingly consumed her narratives. The method would be subtle, intellectual, undeniable. It revolved around my own work, my own ideas, presented in a way that would quietly expose the origins of hers without ever mentioning her name. Some battles aren't fought with shouts. They're won with undeniable truth. I remembered the specific, detailed notes I'd taken over the years in my leather-bound journal. The sketches, the early drafts of proposals, the conceptual frameworks I'd meticulously developed for my textile projects. I began to compile them, not into a formal presentation, but into a series of short, insightful articles for a respected niche online publication that focused on ethical design and sustainable innovation. I wrote them under a pseudonym, Arachne, after the Greek weaver who dared to challenge a goddess. The articles detailed the exact methodologies and philosophical underpinnings of the very concepts Sarah was now celebrated for. I published them sequentially, timed to appear just before and during the summit. My articles were academically rigorous, deeply researched, and presented my ideas with a quiet authority. They included diagrams that matched my old notebooks, phrasing that was undeniably mine, and arguments that echoed my private reflections. They were a breadcrumb trail of truth, laid out for those with discerning eyes to follow. I ensured the timestamps on the digital publications were verifiable, creating an irrefutable record of prior art. David, bless his unseeing eyes, even forwarded one of the articles to me, marveling at the coincidence that someone else was exploring similar ideas to Sarah. "Isn't it fascinating, Helen? Great minds think alike," he'd chuckled over the phone. I merely hummed in agreement, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. It was fascinating indeed. The summit arrived. The air in the conference center buzzed with anticipation. Sarah was scheduled to speak on the second day. On the first day, I attended various sessions, observing, listening. I saw Sarah networking, charming potential collaborators, effortlessly embodying the persona she had constructed. She looked vibrant, confident, bathed in the glow of her perceived success. And for a second, no one said a word. I felt no rage, no desire for her public humiliation. My desire was for clarity, for the scales to balance, for the truth of her appropriation to quietly, firmly settle into the minds of those who valued integrity. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted understanding, a quiet, undeniable understanding. On the morning of Sarah's keynote, I found a seat near the back, unobtrusive, blending into the crowd. The hall filled rapidly. There was a palpable excitement. Her introduction was effusive, highlighting her groundbreaking work and singular vision. When she stepped onto the stage, a ripple of applause went through the room. She looked poised, radiant, commanding. As she began to speak, I listened, not for what she said, but for how she said it, for the familiar cadence of ideas that had once been born in my own mind. She presented the textile project, the one built on my concepts of circular design and community empowerment. She used my very phrases, my analogies, even a specific anecdote I'd shared about a small, struggling artisan community I'd worked with years ago. My articles, quietly published online, were already circulating among some of the more discerning attendees. I knew this because I'd seen a few people discreetly checking their tablets, their brows furrowing in thought as Sarah spoke. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no gasp from the audience, no sudden accusation. It was far more subtle, far more profound. I watched as a few key individuals in the audience, prominent figures in the ethical design world, exchanged quick, knowing glances. I saw a man in the front row, a well-known editor of an industry publication, subtly tap his colleague's arm and point to his tablet screen, where I knew one of my Arachne articles would be open. Their expressions were not of shock, but of quiet, dawning realization. A flicker of recognition, then a subtle shift in their posture, a slight tightening around the eyes. They weren't angry. They were simply seeing. The subtle shifts in the audience were my triumph. It wasn't a collective gasp, but a quiet internal reordering of facts. I saw it in the way a venture capitalist, known for his keen eye for true innovation, slowly lowered his tablet, his gaze fixed on Sarah, but his expression no longer one of unadulterated admiration. It was replaced by a more analytical, almost distant look. He wasn't just listening to her words anymore. He was filtering them through a newly acquired lens, a silent cross-referencing with the Arachne articles that had circulated. Sarah, oblivious, continued her presentation, her voice soaring with confidence. She transitioned seamlessly into the Q&A session, fielding questions with practiced ease. But the nature of the questions began to subtly change. They were less about, "How did you come up with that?" and more about the historical context of certain ideas, the influences, the prior art. They were pointed, though politely phrased, questions that nudged at the edges of her carefully constructed narrative. One young woman, an emerging designer from a respected cooperative, raised her hand. "Ms. Miller," she began, her voice clear, "your discussion of closed-loop systems in textile production is truly insightful. I've been following the work of an independent researcher, Arachne, who has explored similar concepts with remarkable depth. Her recent article on leveraging heirloom techniques for sustainable fashion struck me as particularly resonant with your approach. Have you had a chance to engage with her work?" My heart gave a quiet, almost imperceptible thrum. It wasn't a confrontation, but an invitation for Sarah to acknowledge, to credit, to reveal the true source. And for a second, no one said a word. Sarah paused, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual composed smile. "Oh, yes," she said, a dismissive wave of her hand. "I believe I've seen some of that. There are many voices exploring these ideas now, which is wonderful. But my work, as I've presented it today, is truly the culmination of my own unique journey and research." The lie, delivered with such practiced ease, hung in the air. But now, for many, it was no longer invisible. It had a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of falsity. I didn't need a public confession. I needed the truth to be known. And it was. The seeds were planted. I saw a few audience members nod slowly, their expressions thoughtful, not convinced by her casual dismissal. They preached forgiveness. I chose reckoning. After her session concluded, as people milled around, I stayed in my seat for a few moments, observing. I saw the venture capitalist approach the young designer who had asked the question. They spoke quietly, both glancing towards Sarah, who was now surrounded by admirers, signing autographs and exchanging business cards. Their conversation was animated, hushed. I knew what they were discussing, the Arachne articles, the quiet, undeniable proof. I didn't approach Sarah. There was no need. My work was done. I merely rose from my seat, a deep, abiding sense of peace settling over me, a tranquility I hadn't felt in years. As I walked toward the exit, I passed a small group of industry journalists, their faces intent on their phones. I heard snippets of their conversation. "Have you seen this Arachne piece? The taming is uncanny." It really puts a new spin on Miller's presentation, doesn't it? I didn't look back. The air outside the conference center felt crisp and clean. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face. It wasn't about destroying Sarah, but about reclaiming the truth, about allowing the consequences of her actions to unfold naturally, guided by the quiet dissemination of undeniable facts. I hadn't harmed her. I had merely stopped shielding her from the truth of her own making. My work wasn't a shout. It was a whispered truth, carried on the winds of intellect and undeniable evidence, settling softly but irrevocably into the minds of those who could discern it. This wasn't about being excluded. It was about dismantling their carefully constructed lie. I felt a quiet lightness, a profound sense of liberation. The scales were balancing, not through my force, but through the inherent weight of truth. My grandmother's locket, the subtle appropriations, the grand designs, all of it finally found its rightful place. I had ensured that the truth and its consequences could no longer be ignored, and that my resolve had brought about a justified outcome.